Good morning. Good job, Rachel. I really like those songs. There's a large cooking utensil thing, cooking pot thing downstairs that I didn't need. So if you would like that, please feel free to take it home with you. My favorite show of all time is The Twilight Zone. I love The Twilight Zone, and because I'm 80 years old, I make Hannah watch it with me. She's never seen it before, so we've been watching through it. And we came across my favorite episode probably of television of all time. I think it's the best episode ever, and it's called The Obsolete Man. It's the last episode of season 2. It's really, really good. A man stands on trial in this dystopian government, and it's the state versus this man. And this man's crime is being obsolete. He says that he's a librarian, and he proclaims his faith in God. And the state, this judge, he's all-powerful, and he just says, the state has proven that there is no God. The state has proven that there is no use for books, that words have no worth. The state defines power, and you are sentenced to death for being obsolete. And so he says, but you get to decide how you're going to die. So this man, he says, all right, I want my execution to be televised, and I want to choose an assassin, and only he knows how I'm going to die. So the state says, okay, hey, we're all on board with you being executed and televising it so people, really fear the state and see that we are the true ones in power. And so this man, he invites the judge to come see him before he's executed, and they have this conversation about the meaning of God and that the state can't prove that there isn't a God and all these things. And then the man locks the door. The man who's executed, he locks the door because little does the judge know, the man had requested to die by a bomb going off in his house. So, and then now the door's locked. So then you get to see these two both faced with death. And the man who's been sentenced for being obsolete sits calmly and reads his Bible. While this judge, this authoritative power from the state, he starts progressively getting more scared, more fearful, starts pleading for his life more, and his buddies won't save him because that makes the state look weak. And by the end of it, the man who's been sentenced to death, who has his faith in God, is just sitting there completely calm. And the man who's this power, he's all powerful, it's the state, they have everything. He's pleading and he's a mess. And he's pleading with the man and finally says, in the name of God, let me out. And the man said, yes, in the name of God, I will let you out. And then he lets him out, and the judge is set free, and the man dies. And then you just see this reversal, though. That's what's so beautiful, is who was really the obsolete man? Because the man who faced his death with dignity and knowing that who his God was, he was completely at peace and secure. But when this all-powerful figure, when he was threatened, when death came to him, he crumbled. And that's the way that power works in our world. That's the way that worldly power works. They all claim invincibility. They claim that they're the most powerful ones. They claim that they are the arbiters of what's true and what's good and what's right. And yet, at the end of the day, it all crumbles. It's a castle made out of sand. And that's not unique to the Twilight Zone. Sadly, unfortunately, that's the way the world is and always has been since the fall. So this morning, I want to talk about power structures, worldly power structures, and kingdom power. And I want to talk about the great reversal or divine reversal, how God reverses the things that we think are powerful or the world thinks is powerful, and how he redefines it according to his wisdom. And the Bible has a lot to say about the power structures that existed during their time. The biblical authors repeatedly carried on this motif of a grand reversal over common power structures or systems of their day. And why was that? Well, because power or worth as seen by humans is often antithetical to God's view and his will. It accomplishes the exact opposite of God wants in the world. Though our systems of power are kind of different from the power systems of their day, we still have them. And guess what? They're still not aligned completely with God's will. So we're always going to be living in that tension. And I think of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 27. He says, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And God chose what the world thinks is not important, what the world hates and thinks is nothing. He chose these to destroy what the world thinks is important. God did this so that no one can stand before him and boast about anything. Because there is no power apart from God. And read the book of Daniel. There's my citing of a source there. So the question for us is, how do we interact with the power structures of our day? And I want us to be thinking about this as we go through. So today, let's track this motif of the divine reversal to see what we can learn from it. So the first example is Jacob. And we're going to be talking about the right of the firstborn. You've probably heard about this. John Walton remarks, in Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, the firstborn was not only the primary heir, but also bore special familial and religious responsibilities, often linked with the god's favor. So what's going on here is back then, whenever you leave a will, you usually distribute it equally, right, between your kids. Well, back in the ancient Near East, it's like, okay, no, we're going to put all our eggs in one basket because we don't have guaranteed that all of them are going to make it. You got to think mortality rates were quite different then. So, all right, we're going to put it all behind the firstborn. And not only was it just a material thing, there was a religious aspect, that they carried the religious inheritance of the family. And that was all tied up within the firstborn. But something very strange happens in Genesis 25. If you're an ancient reader, this would be very, very strange, very unexpected. In Genesis 25, it says, "And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?'" By the way, the Hebrew is much more broken up than that. It's kind of incomprehensible because she's in a lot of pain. So it just says, "If so, God, why?" is literally what the Hebrew is more like, because she's just in the thralls of this pain. It says, "So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." The divinely chosen lineage flowed through Jacob and not Esau, which defied the hierarchy of their day. That's not what you do. The firstborn gets all those things, not the younger. Paul later, he points to this exact event as a powerful demonstration of God's authority over human power structures. Look at, or human will. Look at in Romans 9:13. Paul says, "As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then, it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy." He continues this thought in verse 32. He says, "Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone. As it is written, Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." So why Jacob over Esau? Paul points to at the end of verse 32, it's by faith. It's those who are faithful, who have faith in God, that whom God has chosen. And this bears true throughout the lives. If you look throughout Genesis and look at Jacob and Esau's actions, Jacob sought the blessing, though he did very immoral things to gain that blessing. Was the deception right? No, absolutely not. But Jacob still demonstrated faith by desiring what God had promised. He placed a value on the promise or the spiritual lineage. Because remember, the birthright, the blessing, it wasn't just material things. It was that you have the blessing of God, that you have the divine favor of God, and you carry that spiritual significance. And Jacob wanted that. He did immoral things to get it, but he was going to get it anyway. But he had that faith. He placed that value on that spiritual blessing. And we see later in his life, he still makes a lot more mistakes, but he also matures in different ways. At Bethel, Jacob makes a vow to serve God. Jacob prays and acknowledges God as the source of his blessing, and he wrestles with God and is renamed Israel, which is symbolizing his full reliance on God. So he had a different value system, as opposed to Esau. Esau didn't value his spiritual lineage, which implies a lack of faith. Right? Because if he truly believed that it was worth that much, if he truly believed that God's favor was worth earning and that blessing was as worthy as it was, he wouldn't have traded it for a pot of stew. That's what the Hebrew author notes in Hebrews 12:16. It says, "But be careful that no one commits sexual sin, and be careful that no one is like Esau and never thinks about God. As the oldest son, Esau would have inherited everything from his father, but he sold all that for a single meal." And Esau's later actions continue to show that really caveman-like mindset. He didn't have faith. He didn't place value in the things that God had put value upon. In Genesis 26, he marries a Hittite woman, which goes directly against what Abraham had commanded for his descendants. And in chapter 28, he's like, "Oh, they disapprove. Let me marry an Ishmael's family," which was still he didn't get it. It shows his continual spiritual blindness and how his value system was different. He didn't have faith. He was just trying to earn what he wanted, and he didn't want the things of God. Jacob had faith in God's promise, even though he pursued it imperfectly. Esau lived by the flesh, despising spiritual blessings. So God's sovereign choice overthrew how power was determined for his own purposes. Jacob would have gotten that blessing whether he committed deception or not. Usually the problems that we arise for ourselves is because we pursue promises. Think about Abraham and Hagar, right? God promised them a son, but they tried to get it on their own terms instead of on God's terms. But nonetheless, they still had faith in what God had promised. So Jacob, we can see how God overthrew the power structure of the day, of the right of the firstborn. Another one. So David, with nobility and military strength. Here's a quote from an Old Testament scholar, or from ancient Near Eastern scholar. Kingship in the ancient Near East was fundamentally a combination of divine legitimacy, a noble lineage, and military prowess. A ruler's right to reign was often justified through claims of divine favor, aristocratic descent, and proven strength on the battlefield, which kind of makes sense, right? Usually our leaders and politicians, they usually have gone to Ivy League school, their family members are politicians, and they're like great. You look back at their lineage, they've kind of been bred for this, right? It's just kind of been all along. It's been written in the stars, so to speak. But we see how this kind of bears through with Saul. In 1 Samuel 9:1, it says, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite. Notice that. Did you ever notice that? A man of wealth. Saul comes from money. Look at verse 2. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So we have this giant, beautiful, rich man, right? And lo and behold, he becomes king. Like, yeah, that totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. That's the kind of leader we want. And I want you to contrast that. Now, how did he rule? He became insecure about his power. He sought his kingship by violence through going against God's will. He ended up becoming an evil, unreasonable, unreasoning animal, right? He became a tyrant. So he used his physical might, his prowess and everything to try to seize the kingdom on his own terms. And look at 1 Samuel 16. This is when God has rejected Saul as king. It says when they come, God had sent Samuel to go anoint a new king, so Samuel obeys. It says when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. God told him to go get Jesse, bring his kids before him. It says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. So I just think that's funny that Jesse didn't even think to bring David. Like, it was just not even a thought. He's like, oh, yeah, let me get my kids. One of my kids is going to be king. Awesome. And poor little David's out there just in the field with the sheep. So rather than selecting a wealthy, powerful, or influential man like Saul, or a super tall man, right, or super duper most beautiful man in all the land, God chooses a humble, blue-collar shepherd boy. And not just a shepherd. That would already be unheard of. Shepherds were kind of seen as just like the grunts. They're kind of like the grunts of society. And we see in Genesis, the Egyptians despise shepherds. They're like, we don't even want them here, get them in a different land, a different plot of land, because that's just not cool. That's not what's going on right now. And it was used as a metaphor, but rarely would you conceive of a shepherd actually being a king, let alone the youngest of the shepherds being a king. You think about that? God is just dismantling these power systems that they had in play, these power expectations of the day on level after level here. Kings in the ancient Near East were often tyrannical or self-glorifying, and that's exactly what we see Saul do. Shepherds, by contrast, were protective, sacrificial caretakers, and David's background symbolized a different model of leadership, one based on serving rather than ruling. So we can see God has a purpose to dismantling this power expectation of their day. So let's look at the third one, the wise woman. And this has to do with the male-dominated political and military authority. This is one of my favorite biblical stories. This chapter is so cool. Here's a quote here from an ancient Near Eastern scholar. The political and military framework of the ancient Near East was built on a fundamentally patriarchal system, where authority was concentrated in the hands of male rulers, generals, and officials. Governance and warfare were considered male domains, reinforced by legal codes, religious traditions, and dynastic succession. So, just for some context here, remember Absalom tried to stage a military coup against his own father, and he was pretty successful for a while. He took the main city, but then eventually he ended up like that. He ended up in a tree, and Joab putting some good old spears through poor old Absalom there in the tree. So if you go back to chapter 17, we see that Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab, and what we learned is he's actually related to David. Amasa is a nephew of David. And in 2 Samuel 19, verse 12, so this is after Absalom has been killed, the kingdom's restored back to David. It says, David sent a messenger to Amasa, to the people. He says, you are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of my army from now on in place of Joab. So David was still pretty mad about Joab killing his son. So he's like, all right, he's getting fired from his military position. And I'm setting Amasa over. And again, Amasa has just been the general for the military coup against David. So think about how much David did not like Joab at this moment. So Joab is getting replaced with his power. And so look at verse 1 of chapter 20. This is right after all these events. It says, now there happened to be there a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew the trumpet. By the way, Benjamite, why is that significant? Saul was a Benjamite. Do you think a Benjamite might have some bad feelings towards David? Maybe, yeah, we see that happen. So it says, and he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So again, another coup. Another coup is happening. Verse 7, it says, and there went out after him Joab's men and all the Kerethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men. They went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. All right, so Joab's after him. And if you know anything about Joab, he's a crazy guy. He's got a screw loose. Have you ever met those people who just like, their eyes are just like, you're like, oh, I don't want to make that guy angry. Like, I picture that's like Joab. Like, this is an animal. This is not a human being that I'm speaking to. And not only that, not only is Joab after Sheba, but also the mighty men. Now, there's a whole section in Scripture about the mighty men and their military accolades. One just like killed a leopard in the snow. I want that to be a movie. I want to see that in a movie sometime. Like, just all these crazy military feats that these people did. So you got like the Navy SEALs after you, and one, you like your crazy uncle, right? That like can live in the woods for months at a time. Like, this is who's after Sheba, like terrifying event. So along the way to squash this hostile takeover, Joab has to make a pit stop. All right, I've never quite caught this in the storyline before, but look at verse 9. It says, so Joab stops by, gets Amasa, and Joab said to Amasa, is it well with you, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. This is after Joab's like, oh, I dropped my sword. And he's like, oh, come here. So he says, but Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand. So Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, the son of Bichri, and one of Joab's young men took his stand by Amasa and said, whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. I'd be like, yeah, I'm following Joab after I saw that guy's entrails spill out on the ground. Yeah, go Joab. But notice what Joab did here. He's on the way to squash this military rebellion, but Joab's like, yeah, I don't like that he took my position of power. That's my position. They're at peace. He's the commander of David's army. And Joab says, yeah, no, I want my job back. And they're related. They're relatives. They're cousins. And he just stabbed him in the stomach because his position was threatened. And, that's all a shock to us, but, we all have, we have a very proper giving society and everything, but we're all just seconds away from taking the life of another human. When you think about it, when your life is threatened, when the welfare of your family is threatened, we can become monsters very quickly because of the power systems that we live in, how we value this self-preservation. So contrast this. Think of that, what's going on right there. Verse 15, it says, and all the men who were with Joab came and besieged him in Abel of Beth-maachah, They cast up a mound against the city, and it stood against the rampart, and they were battering the wall to throw it down. So Sheba sought refuge in the city. He's hiding in the city, so Joab and his Navy SEALs, they're battering the city down. They're going to burn it to the ground. Verse 16, then a wise woman called from the city, listen, tell Joab, come here that I may speak to you. And he came near her. And the woman said, are you Joab? He answered, I am. Then she said to him, listen to the words of your servant. And he answered, I am listening. Then she said, they used to say in former times, let them but ask counsel at Abel. So they settled a matter. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the heritage of the Lord? Joab answered, far be it from me. Far be it that I should swallow up or destroy. Yeah, far be it from you, Joab. You never destroy something. Verse 21, that is not true. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim called Sheba, the son of Bichri, has lifted up his hand against King David. Give up him alone, and I will withdraw from the city. And the woman said to Joab, behold, his head shall be thrown to you over the wall. Then the woman went to all people in her wisdom, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and threw it out to Joab. So he blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, every man to his home. And Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. So think about the power through violence versus the power through wisdom. Joab preserved his interest through violence. The wise woman preserves her interest through wisdom and diplomacy. And think about what their interests were. Joab's were self-serving, right? He wanted to preserve his status. He wanted to preserve his role. The wise woman, it was a sacrificial interest. She wanted to preserve the city. She wanted to preserve the people of her city. And so we see not only what they value differently, but how they achieved their means. I think of Proverbs 16:32. It says, it is better to be patient than to be a strong soldier. It is better to control your anger than to capture a city. Because we see that manifest. I just picture this like old lady there, and then I picture Joab, this dude who probably still has blood on him from the guy's entrails that spilled on the ground, and then she was able to reason with him. She was able to reason with him and calm down and succeed, kind of get a military victory through wisdom. Having no power, having no sword, she was able to defeat, in a way, this crazed, violent monster. In God's value system, peaceful wisdom is far more potent than the might of military strength. So we see how God has done away with the right of the firstborn, or subverted it, how he subverted nobility and military strength through choosing David. We've seen how God used this wise woman to accomplish really a military victory through, despite the power structures of the day. But also I want to look at this one, which is the lepers, because of the societal rejection of the unclean, because those with the skin disease and an honor-shame society, they were unclean. So in 2 Kings 6:24, it says, afterward Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. This is the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom. It says, and there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until, think about this, a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. Who's hungry? They were. This is what's going on. They're literally selling it. You could turn a profit selling dove's dung. Think about the state of that. So in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, but Elisha said, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. I wonder if anyone was eating any of that stuff. The foreman stuff was like, wait, what? I'm not going to hold off eating this. Verse 2, then the captain on whose hand the king leaned said to the man of God, if Yahweh himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? But he said, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. So in verse 3, it says, now there are 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate. So again, they're ostracized from the city. They're not allowed in the city because they're unclean. They're lepers. They have the skin disease. They say, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. It's kind of funny. If they kill us, we're just going to die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there is no one there. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the king of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. Verse 8, and when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, and they went into a tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. This is feast day. Like, oh, yes, there's been a famine. We're rejected. Now we're like the richest people. We are the richest people in Israel right now. Verse 9, then they said to one another, we are not doing right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, we came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there, nothing but horses tied and the donkeys tied and the tents as they were. Think about, that was pretty generous of them. From people who are going to be excluded from city life, that they're kind of on their own, and now they have all their provisions for the rest of their life as much as they want, and they're like, we can't hoard this all to ourselves. We got to share this. We got to share this with our people. But look at the response. Verse 11, then the gatekeepers called out, and it was told within the king's household. And the king rose in the night and said to his servants, I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking, when they come out of the city, we shall take them alive and get into the city. So what is that good news met with? Skepticism. No, it's a trap. Despite what the prophet had just said. God had revealed to them that they're going to have so much food tomorrow. Look at verse 16. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine, verse 16, of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. So think about this. He has charge of the gate. You know what that means? He controls who gets in and who gets out. Again, he gets to decide. He's in that position of power. But look what happens. And the people trampled him in the gate so that he died, as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. So in him trying to regulate who went in and who went out, he got trampled to death. Very ironic. So the lepers initially hoarded the spoils, but then realized their duty to share the good news with the city, to share with this new wealth that they had found. The captain, representing royal authority, sought to control access to the city's resources. He was in charge of the gate. God entrusts his revelation not to the powerful, but to those who are willing to proclaim it selflessly. It wasn't the captain of the guard who went and discovered this. It wasn't the king himself. It was these lowly, rejected, poor, societal outcasts. And I think God made it happen that way for a reason, because he knew these people would share it. They would share the salvation that God had brought about. So we're going to finally look at the upside-down kingdom. This is the application portion for us, in which Jesus' upside-down kingdom attacks every worldly power structure. It's not one aspect of it, it's all of it. In Mark 9:35, it's just one statement. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. What power structure works that way? What company do you know that the janitor is the CEO? Just doesn't happen. That's not how we operate. So what systems of power, and here's the question for us, what systems of power are we following? Because these ideas of how the world values power and the systems that we live in, it permeates, because how we live out these truths is in our church communities. I'm not saying I'm definitely not saying we don't stage military coups. We don't try to make the government work like God's kingdom is supposed to. We rule this in the church. We follow Christ's rule in the church. As Paul says, what have I to do with judging outsiders? They're not those inside the church, and we are to judge. This is where we actualize kingdom values, is in our communities. So first off, status or servanthood. Worldly power, you are only as great as your achievements and your reputation. In kingdom power, you are only as great as your willingness to serve. If you look at the leadership in the church, we see in 1 Peter 5:1, Peter writes, so I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, he will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, and then after this, listen to this, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble? Do we keep alive the system of deeming who and who shouldn't be spiritual leaders based on their earthly accomplishments? Do we have the idea of he would be a good elder because he is a CEO? Or do we learn from David and learn that a janitor might be a far more qualified leader based on their spiritual example? Because it's not based on reputation, accolades, it's based on the heart. We need to see as God sees, not as man sees. We need to be careful that this doesn't permeate our thinking. Second, wealth or worship. Worldly power, security is found in money, possessions, and influence. In kingdom power, riches means nothing without generosity and surrender. In Luke 6:20, Jesus says, and he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." And he says in verse 24, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets." Do we view those who are wealthy as being especially favored by God? Or do you, if you're in a position of wealth, do you view yourself as, oh, God is just especially pleased with me, as opposed to those who struggle and you think maybe they're less deserving or maybe they were not as good stewards? Or do we learn from the poor lepers who were marked as people who shared whatever good that they encountered with others? And everything's a blessing. So if you're blessed, yes, that comes from God. But don't deem, oh, God likes them more, or God's especially more happy with me because I have X amount in my bank account. It doesn't matter. I know some of the most giving, self-giving Christians that are in a state of poverty. And you know why? Usually because they forsook their worldly careers where they were making a lot of money because they didn't feel right about it. So that material wealth does not determine spiritual worthiness. We got to get rid of that equation. Now, every good and perfect gift comes from God, absolutely. But we don't need to have this scale of more or less value then based on what's in our bank account. And we need to make sure we don't view ourselves or other people that way. 3, role or readiness. Worldly power, only certain people deserve influence based on gender or social or family position. In kingdom power, God calls the unexpected to leave, serve, and proclaim truth. I think of Romans 16, 1-2. Paul says, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in Cenchreae, and that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you. For she has been a patron of many and of myself as well." Now, the word there that Paul uses is prostatus, and it means a female guardian or protector, a supporter. And so Paul's saying, hey, this woman has been like my guardian, my benefactor, and she's been that for a lot of people. And think about it, she was the one who actually delivered this letter. And usually, if you were a messenger, deliverer of a letter, you didn't just deliver it, you read it as well. So Paul entrusted this very important document with this woman, Phoebe. I think that's extremely powerful. And look at 1 Corinthians 7:32. I think often we have the idea, or we put pressure on that good Christians, get married and have kids, and we often neglect the singles or those who don't have kids. I think about what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7:32. "I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife." Now, Paul isn't saying that it's bad to be married, but you can have just as much, if not more, meaningful relationship being single or not having kids by dedicating yourself to Christ, by seeking that love and attention and seeking through your singleness or through not having kids. Paul wasn't married. Jesus wasn't married. And I'm pretty sure they had pretty influential lives, pretty meaningful, rich lives despite not having a wife. I think we need to be careful that we don't have that value system. Oh, you're worth more because you're married and have kids, or you're not as much of a priority because you're not married. Those things should not exist in our church communities. Finally, seizing or surrender. Worldly powers, if you want it, you have to take it. In kingdom power, if you want true power, you have to submit to others. I think of James 3, verse 14, where he writes, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth." All right, why would they be boasting? Well, it's because their selfish ambition they've conflated with a good thing. That they think they're doing a good thing. They think they're being zealous, but it's selfish ambition. He says this is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly and spiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. When you see disorder in a church, guess what there is also? Selfish ambition, jealousy, and bitterness. You can't have one without the other. That's how it happens. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Open to reason is so important. If no one's ever been able to bring something to your attention and change your mind, if you haven't had your mind changed, two options. Either you are right about everything, which, wow, that's really impressive. Please, I have a lot of questions for you. Or there's arrogance and an unwillingness to learn. Don't have a spirit that comes from God. You don't have a spirit of wisdom. So if we don't like, I think we see this sometimes, if we don't like the way things are going, do we seize control through gossip and character assassination, or through wisdom, seeking God, prayer, honest discussion, maybe even honest rebuke if it's required? But when there's disorder, you're going to see gossip, bitterness, and selfish ambition. One can't exist without the other. So finally, are we building up or tearing down worldly power structures in our hearts? I think of Isaiah 58, verse 6, beautiful chapter. It says, "Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard." Do we take that seriously? Do we take it as it's our mission to tear down whatever worldly power structures exist in our churches, in our hearts, in our minds? Do we work at tearing that down, or are we subconsciously just keeping the status quo and maintaining those things? Jesus says, "Blessed are the weak, for they shall inherit the earth." And 2 Peter writes, "But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." In other words, where God's power structure reigns, not the power of the world. "Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish and at peace." So my final question is, have you submitted to God's kingdom reign? Because God's kingdom reign brings life, it brings peace. Everything else brings disorder and death. If you would like to become a part of God's power structure that leads to life, we ask that you come forward, be baptized.